The main story this lunchtime, the Attorney-General has ruled that the Mick Wallace bill on abortion is unconstitutional. The bill was due to come before the Dáil next week. The government made the announcement a short time ago. In an interview for this programme, Health Minister Simon Harris said that the independent TD's bill, which would allow for abortion in the case of fatal fetal abnormalities, is unconstitutional and the government must therefore oppose it. The Minister began the interview by talking about his bill dealing with the misuse of drugs, a move hastened by the Gardaí's concern about drug dealing in Dublin's north inner city.
Well, as you know, Richard, after the spate of brutal murders in the North Inner City, An Garda Síochána had a number of engagements with the government and asked for a significant amount of tools to be put in place to help combat the ongoing brutal violence out there. And one of the issues the Gardaí highlighted to government was the need for some more drugs to be controlled. So specifically prescription drugs, medication that you or I, if we were prescribed them by a doctor, would be appropriate to take, but that are actually being used significantly in terms of dealing in the North Inner City and indeed in other parts of this country. They haven't actually been controlled. So what I'm proposing to do, and I have expedited it through government, is amend the Misuse of Drugs Act to include a number of these drugs commonly known as benzos or Z drugs, which are certain prescription medication that are now being sold illegally on the street. Whilst the guards today have the opportunity to confiscate the drugs if they come across them, they don't have the tools that they'd have in relation to other drugs in terms of searching the person, searching the vehicle, or indeed prosecuting people. So I just want to be very clear, though, this legislation is not about targeting addicts, or it's not about cracking down on addicts. I believe as Minister for Health it's very important we provide support to people with addiction. But it is about giving the Gardaí the tools that they have told us that they need so that they can confront the gangs operating in certain parts of our capital city.
The experts who work in this area say they have a concern that if you put the so-called Z products or any products on a list like this, is that what happens is that the manufacturers move very quickly to alter slightly the ingredients to something else, and therefore it's legal.
No, and I've already sought legal advice in relation to that, regardless of whether the package or substance is somewhat tweaked. Once the controlled drug itself is present, the legal advice to me is that this legislation will be sufficient. So, I mean, I do need to be clear, though, that this is only part of the government's approach to drugs. There will be further legislation later this year. There will be a new national drug strategy delivered by Minister Catherine Byrne by the end of the year to look at how we support people undergoing addiction. But as Minister for Health and indeed as a member of the government, when the guards tell me that they need additional supports to carry out their jobs in tackling gangs in this country, I feel and the government feel duty bound to act. And whilst this legislation wasn't due to be passed by the Oireachtas until nearly the end of this year, thanks to the cooperation that I've been afforded by opposition parties, I now am in a position to take this legislation through the Seanad today and hopefully into the Dáil in the coming weeks. And I would hope that we can get this law signed into law by the time the Dáil and the Seanad rise for the summer recess.
If I could just ask you a couple of other questions about matters in your brief, Minister. The 8th Amendment, what's happening with the Mick Wallace bill, which was to come into the Dáil next Thursday?
Well, I fully understand what Deputy Wallace is trying to do, and I've said very clearly on the record that I find the current situation facing parents experiencing fatal fetal abnormalities in this country to be utterly unacceptable. But I am duty bound as Minister for Health to make sure that any actions we take are constitutional, that they're legal and that they'll actually have an impact. I've been consulting the Attorney-General in relation to Deputy Wallace's bill. This bill is pretty identical to a previous bill tabled in the Oireachtas last year, and the advice available to me and the advice I will be making available to government colleagues is that the bill is not constitutional, and that arises from the fact that there is a very explicit protection of the right to the life of the unborn in our constitution. So really these issues need to be addressed through a citizens' assembly whereby they can be discussed, a proper debate can take place, expert views can be heard, and ultimately that is the right forum. So whilst I very much respect what Deputy Wallace is trying to do, I won't be in a position to accept the bill because, quite frankly, it won't make the meaningful impacts that he thinks it will because it's not constitutional.
What do you say to the charge made this week from the pro-life campaign that citizens' assembly is effectively a sham, that the membership and the outcome already decided?
Well, I don't really know how they can arrive at that assertion. Not one person has been appointed to the Citizens' Assembly so far. 100 people will be selected at random, with particular consideration obviously given to issues like gender and geography. The Taoiseach brought a memo to government on this week. The chairperson will be, I think the role of the chairperson will be extremely important. It has to be somebody that we, the public, regardless of people's views on issues, and remember the Citizens' Assembly will consider a number of issues, not just the 8th Amendment. It's important that we can all have confidence in the integrity and ability of that chairperson, and the appointment of the appropriate chairperson will be very important. But I think before anybody moves to try and rubbish any structure, it's usually good practice to at least wait and see how that structure develops.
Can I ask you about the report from the Health Research Board this week showing the phenomenal implications of alcohol consumption in this country on a whole range of levels? Just for people who aren't familiar with it, the report said that alcohol consumption was responsible for 3 deaths every day in this country in 2013. Consumption having a marked impact on the health service, with 1 out of every €10 of our health budget going on alcohol-related problems, and that excludes the cost of patients entering the system via the emergency departments, the cost of GP visits, psychiatric admissions, and so on. Is that not deeply worrying?
It's extraordinarily worrying. It's very worrying to me as Health Minister. It's very worrying to all of us as citizens. I think what the report has told us is, I suppose, what we know in this country but sometimes don't like to face up to, is that we have a problem with alcohol here in Ireland. We have a cultural problem, and that problem is having a real impact on our health service. It's having a real impact on our ability to deliver health services. And what the report shows yesterday, as you quite correctly say, if 1/10 of our health budget is now being spent on dealing with alcohol-related diseases, that's about €1.4 billion every year, apart from obviously the devastating impact that alcohol misuse is having on many families and many communities. As you know, we have the Public Health Alcohol Bill, which does propose a range of measures to address issues relating to alcohol, including minimum pricing, issues regarding labelling, segregation within shops, regulation of advertising, regulation of sponsorship. I believe passionately in this bill, as did my predecessor, Minister Varadkar. I've restored it to the order paper in the Seanad, and my colleague, the new Minister for Health Promotion, Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy, will be taking this through the Oireachtas. There is an important point, though, that you'll be aware of, that some other member states in the European Union have raised concerns in relation to this, and my message to them very simply as the Irish Health Minister is, I have to be allowed the tools necessary to deal with a major public health issue here in this country, and subsidiarity must apply. If there's an issue in a specific member state, the government of that day has to be allowed the ability to introduce the policy measures that it believes is appropriate.
Well, what timeline do you have on this? When will this law come into effect?
The bill passed the second stage, so that's the initial stage for your listeners, of the Seanad in the last Oireachtas. I've restored it to the order paper at committee stage, which is the next step in the process, and I expect committee stage to be taken very early after the Dáil resumes and the Seanad resumes from its summer recess. So there is still a journey to go on this, there's no point me denying that there's not. There's a number of issues to tease out with Europe, but this is a priority piece of legislation for myself and Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy, and I expect we'll see committee stage in the autumn.
Well, on budgets, it was stated in the Dáil this week, there will be no further cash available for overspending in the Department of Health this year or next. You've got an extra 500. Is that going to be enough for a health service that simply doesn't know and will never know exactly how much it's going to have to spend from year to year, and that if you cut or if you put a cap on it, inevitably people will suffer?
Well, I think that the last part of your question is the key part, because how much does our health service actually require each and every year, and exactly what sort of health service are we trying to fund is the key question. That's why I want a 10-year plan for the Irish Public Health Service. That's why the cross-party committee charged with drawing this up is meeting for the first time today. But at the end of the day, the health service, like all parts of our public service, does have to live within budget. We have, and I as Minister for Health within only weeks in office, have been able to deliver an additional €500 million to the Irish Health Service. The health budget is now €14.1 billion for this year, and my message very clearly is that managers now must manage. People who are paid sums of money to manage the public health service, to manage taxpayers' money, must now do that. And I want to be clear, there's examples of very good management in certain hospitals and certain parts of our health service, and quite frankly there's examples of very bad management. What I will now be doing is I will be meeting with the hospital group CEOs and the hospital group chairs, along with the Director General of the HSE in the first and second weeks of July, and I'll be laying out a very clear message to them. As Minister for Health, I've delivered additional resources for them to deliver the health service, much needed resources in important areas, but they now must do their job. They must do their part of the bargain, which is manage. And if they do that, it enables me in budget 2017, if I can obtain additional resources, to continue to improve services. If they don't do that, it means my allocation in budget 2017 simply will have to be used to meet an overrun.
And if
both sides have to live up to their part of the deal here.
Sure, and if for whatever reason there's an increase in admissions and you don't have the money to spend in looking after those people, you simply say to them what? you go on the waiting list, we're sorry?
No, I've as a result of the additional resources that I've provided to the health service, a number of the difficult challenges that were being experienced can now be addressed. The HSE have told me very clearly, and I have to take my advice from the HSE on this, they've told me very clearly that the health service is now on a sustainable footing and that with careful management they can live in budget. When the HSE tells me that, I expect the HSE to deliver that. The additional resources means there'll be more frontline staff working on our health service this year than last year. There'll be more home health packages, there'll be more funding for mental health, more funding for disability. You're right, there are continued pressures on the Irish Health Service, but as Minister for Health I am now presiding over a period of reinvestment in the Irish Public Health Service after a number of difficult years. But to be able to do that effectively, to make the difference for the very patients you talk about, I do need managers to do their piece in terms of managing effectively.
Health Minister Simon Harris talking to us a short time ago. You're listening to the News at 1. It's 19 minutes past 1.